So I thought I would record a video talking about quite an intense but important topic. So let me start this off by saying that this could be a trigger warning, that this is very direct stuff about some deeper insights that can arise through investigating our own nature of identity, the feeling of being a self, some meditation practice, inquiry. All of these techniques can lead us to some quite deep shifts. And what I want to talk about is how these shifts can be interpreted by the mind to be quite scary, but that's not the full story. So the motivation to talk about this comes from having spoken with somebody one-on-one about this recently that had a quite big shift in their experience of self and the world and what's actually going on. And at first it was quite freeing and relieving to see that there's no you at the center of experience that has to navigate this world. But what happens is often when we get a glimpse of this without seeing the full picture, and if there's still a lot of kind of repressed emotion work, shadow work, resistances, trauma work that hasn't been processed yet, the mind can spin this story into quite a traumatic event for the self if it's still there. So again, this is quite direct. So if what I'm saying just makes no sense and it just makes you uncomfortable, feel in for yourself whether this is right for you. Some people this might resonate with, but this is kind of a much deeper topic than just recovery from chronic illness and the other things I talk about on this channel. But yeah, I wanted to talk about this because I've had my own experiences with this, and it's a challenging period to navigate, but I want to say that it's not the full story, right? So when something like this happens, basically the mind gets a glimpse of something beyond itself, but seeing that it's not in control in the way that it thought it was. The feeling of being you is kind of illusory, and your own personal will and all the things, the concepts that you assign meaning to can be seen to be empty in a certain way. And again, depending on what kind of work we've done, this can be really triggering and scary. But this is it's not the full thing, right? So it's a good place to go. But when we still have so much attachment, like there's a massive sense of loss that comes with this. And we need to acknowledge that, right? So if I'm talking to somebody that's kind of having this experience saying, I've lost everything. I had this kind of shift, but along with that, I lost everything. And, now it's the worst thing that's ever happened to me. That's from the mind's perspective. That's from the perspective of the illusion. But I want to acknowledge the sense of loss because it needs to be processed. So often with these kinds of teachings, and there's lots of this kind of stuff online about awakening and non-duality, there's often a big element of bypassing the emotions through kind of fixating on the insights. And it's really important to allow the sense of grief and loss to be felt, but not to identify with that. That's really the crux here, is give yourself the feeling, that the space to feel that loss, that yes, you're losing the sense of the one who had their own will and life in the world with other concepts and everything. Like, once you get a sense that that's not quite the case, you're gonna have to process this loss at some point, right? And yeah, it's very circumstantial depending on the person and their conditioning. Like maybe somebody who's dealt with a lot of loss in their life already has already processed a lot of this. But if you're somebody that hasn't, maybe you've just haven't come into contact with that, it's gonna be a massive thing. So yeah, I remember from my own experience this kind of stage, and it was a very dark period for me. But if I look back from my perspective now, it was because my mind had kind of grabbed hold of this story and was spinning a web of suffering around it that was all just kind of, how can I say it? Like I like the Lisa Cairns. I once listened to one of her talks talking about this, and it's like the mind throwing a tantrum that it's not in control in the way that it thought it was. And then it can, spin all these stories about, oh, everything's meaningless, everything's pointless, how can I have any, like sense of wanting to carry on if there's no meaning in anything, if there's no, there's no will, if everything's empty of meaning. But that has got the flavor of the mind making a whole bunch of assumptions already, that you need meaning and purpose and will. That's already going up into the sense of the illusion of the mind. It's like you have to see through what assumptions and thoughts are you believing that is making this kind of story real for you, but it's not. So I'm not sure how this comes across as I'm speaking. It's difficult to talk about, but let me say it like this. For me, I kind of got out of that phase by seeing that the kind of, it was a tantrum of the mind that, and beliefs around, because there's no meaning, this means that. This means that, I must throw a tantrum. Whereas seeing that kind of pure experience on its own is way more remarkable and kind of just ineffable, fucking wondrous. But you have to go through this phase of loss, right? So that's what I'm saying. You can't just bypass it by saying like, oh yeah, but the richness of everything, of pure experience without labels, is just so mind-boggling that I shouldn't feel the loss. So that's why it's kind of like, when I'm talking about this, I want you to acknowledge the loss. You're losing a lot, but everything you're losing is illusion. So this is another thing that's helpful here, is you're not losing anything real. You're not, all the grief, all the loss is loss of kind of a false filter that we were placing on top of our experience. And so whatever you're losing, you're coming more in contact with direct truth, with what's actually real. And it's so worth it. It's so worth it to lose those filters. But you have to kind of process the grief. You have to go through the letting go that the mind doesn't want to do. So there's going to be friction. There's going to be tension. There's going to be times where it feels like it's just way too much and you're losing everything and you just can't take it. And that's fine. It's absolutely okay. It's important to acknowledge that, to acknowledge. Again, this phase is only a problem because we don't want to feel something. So again, recently talking with somebody about this, it's like, okay, we'll talk about the grief, we'll talk about this, and then the mind will come on and say, but I feel like I've lost everything. And there's a hidden assumption there that I shouldn't feel that. But if you just kind of detach from the story a bit and say, okay, what does this feeling bring up that I don't want to feel? Why is it a problem to really acknowledge grief? And it is, there's resistance, sometimes, if we haven't come into contact with grief yet, if we haven't learned to really let go into the experience, it's challenging at first. So that's fine. Acknowledge the resistance around it, acknowledge the friction, but see how the mind is creating the problem itself by fighting with experience. So yeah, I want to say like that's definitely not the final resting point. Like if somebody has a shift and they see, I don't have the sense of control that I thought I did. There's not really the sense of me that I thought there was. There's not really the sense of the every kind of thing that I'd assigned meaning to in my life. It's not really the case. And that feels really like the way the mind interprets this can be different. So for sometimes that can be really freeing. It's like, oh my gosh, there's nothing to worry about. There's no problem. There's just this unfolding on its own. But then often there's then the mind, the ego sees where this is really going, kind of completely beyond itself. And then it kind of will start reacting like, oh my gosh, this is the worst possible thing ever. Whatever. If you're in that phase, that's not the final place. Like, absolutely. Where this goes is to a complete intimacy and kind of absolute appreciation of just whatever is arising in each moment. So that feeling of loss of concept and meaning and purpose is just like a letting go process that needs to happen. It's like, yeah, we need to let go of all the identities around that, all the beliefs around that, and it will feel really difficult. But if we just keep on feeling and being sincere with ourselves and seeing where we're kind of getting caught up in the mind, and we just let this keep on going deeper, it's worth it, right? It's seen that all of that was unnecessary, that kind of we were trading like what is the cost of needing meaning? It's kind of looking past the pure wonder and everything you've ever wanted in just anything arising. Again, this can make no sense, but to see beyond meaning opens up the possibility that the arising of experience is just absolutely wondrous already. So, but we have to let go to see that, right? So that's the friction. But that's what I want to just say, that there is kind of this deep peace, intimacy stuff that comes later on. So don't think that, oh shit, this is it, I'm in this dark hole. It's like that's because the mind has had some insight, but there's lots of processing of repressed emotions to do. And if we don't open up to doing that processing, which is simple work, it's an opening up, it's an allowing, but it's challenging. If we don't acknowledge that, then it can feel like a really difficult thing that's happened, because we've lost our ability to avoid those things through mental kind of games, basically, of saying, oh, okay, I'm going to get this in my life in the future. I'm going to make my life this way. I'm going to do this. I'm going to succeed here. I'm going to get that. And that's going to solve my problems. And when we see that that's not really the case, that the future is kind of just a constant delving into mental thoughts, it's just not there. It's a carrot on a stick. Once we see through that, then we have to face what's left. And if we're unwilling to face that, which we probably will be initially, that's a part of the process, is to go through that unwillingness to do the difficult work. And then eventually kind of maturity arises, and that can come through seeing that there's no other way. Once we do this work, it's really worth it. So yeah, I don't know how that comes across. I just thought to talk about the topic, because I remember the really difficult phase for me of kind of getting a taste, but it wasn't awakening, right? It was getting a taste of no self, no controller, and that was so difficult because my identity that I was using to keep all the emotional repression at bay was based on a strong sense of personal will to make my future better. And yeah, letting go of that forced me to go into the difficult stuff that I didn't want to go into at the time. So I was stuck in a really difficult place for a while, really dark place. And yeah, but it's all got to do with just getting caught up in mental games and resistances. And it's just so worth it in the end. So yeah, don't know how that comes across.